I want to use this video to talk about what made the United States the predominant superpower post World War II. Americans failed to acknowledge that it was almost entirely luck. And a series of happy accidents. Having the oceans, the Atlantic and Pacific, on both sides of us saved the Americas from a lot of other things. And by the Americas, I'm talking about post-colonial United States. The same rules don't apply to South and Central America, and the reason those rules don't apply is Spain. So, as you're looking at it, you have to realize let's go back to when the European nations started to go out into the world for the express purpose of colonizing. Spain is the best example of this because what Spain would do was they would go to South America, the Caribbean, North America, the Indonesian islands, and they would destroy those cultures. I mean literally destroy. Spain, during their colonial period, did what the United States and Israel are doing now. So they weren't going after conquering. Yes, they intended to steal natural resources. They intended to drain the wealth from those countries that they were quote-unquote exploring. They had every intention of doing that. But in their minds, in order to do that, they had to erase the civilizations that were there. And erase is the proper word here, right? So I'm not being dramatic. I mean, you look at what the Spaniards did to the Caribbeans, what the French did to the Jamaicans, and you see this is what they were doing. They were actually trying to erase those cultures. So in addition to extracting all of the wealth, they took the cultural identity away, and there was no civilization left that could rebuild. They did what the United States has been doing to Iran since 1950s. They were removing all of those civil institutions that can develop and build a successful government. And Spain was very successful at doing that. The Spanish basically erased all of the civilizations that existed in South America prior to colonization. So that's the exception for South and Central America. That's why they didn't advance in the same vein as the U.S. There was a little bit of good planning. Theodore Roosevelt decided to invest heavily in a navy. And then the President Hoover, President Roosevelt, Franklin Delano, they invested heavily in an Air Force. And then, of course, the DARPA legislation, which allowed the U.S. to advance its military faster than any other country in the world. Because when your military contractors have unlimited budgets and no accountability, because remember, with DARPA, you don't have to deliver. You're not obligated to deliver a technology, which is a serious problem with DARPA. I discussed in a prior video about why the American economy sucks, and I also discussed that in what we get wrong about government assistance. But DARPA allowed the U.S. military to really advance in ways that no other military could advance. But that actually had less to do with the fact that we became a superpower than luck. Now, in Asia, and China's the exception. Hopefully I'll remember, because I remembered in another video I was talking about med school tuitions and forgot to come back to it. So hopefully in this one I'll remember. China is an exception, and there's a very good reason China is an exception. And China is the exception because of the United States and the United Kingdom primarily. Not specifically, but 80%, maybe 75, 80, 85% because of the United States and the United Kingdom. Shanghai. But Shanghai becoming China. And I'll get into that hopefully later in the video if I remember. Going back to maybe the 18th century, a little before, that whole Asian peninsula, so we're talking Japan, China, Mongolia, Koreas, Russia, they've been at war since then up until the Second World War, the end of the Second World War. So you had the Sino-Chinese War, you had the Sino-Russian War, you had the Korean invasion, you had the invasion. Everybody wanted Manchuria in China because Manchuria at the time was rich in natural resources, precious metals, petroleum, all of that. It all existed in Manchuria, and everybody was trying to conquer Manchuria and strip it away from the Qin dynasty. But ultimately they couldn't. So you've had, by the beginning of World War II, in this Pacific Rim, you've had approximately 200 years of war already. And this war hasn't ended yet. It ended because of World War II. Now, I'm not the best guy to explain all of this history. I like Sarah Payne, Dr. Payne at the Naval War College. I get the impression that this was her doctoral work in school. She may not be a doctor, she may just be a professor, but she's really, she's on it, man. She knows her stuff, and she's well sourced. And I'll link to a YouTube channel where you can find her stuff if you're interested in learning more. But she really is the expert in this area. She's really good, and she explains it so well. But basically, for 3 centuries, the Pacific Rim was at war for the purpose of conquering primarily Manchuria. Of course, they all had their colonial eyes on the whole thing. They wanted all of it. And it was the Japanese and the Russians primarily. And the Chinese would try to conquer Japan. The Chinese ultimately would successfully conquer Korea after Mao Zedong would come to power. Now, back to the point of the video. What made the U.S. the primary superpower in the world? Of course, everyone is going to talk about Reagan and the collapse of the Soviet Union, but in the end, that had almost nothing to do with it. And the reason that I say that is the Second World War pretty much occurred over the entire world, right? And everybody was in combat. The European colonial powers, we talked about the Pacific Rim colonial powers. In Africa, the European colonial powers did the same thing to Africa that Spain did to South and Central America. So the Europeans went into Africa, they extracted all of the wealth, they destroyed all the civil institutions that could develop and grow any form of government. Now, when I'm saying that, I'm not just talking about democracies. I'm not talking about the Western image of government. I'm not talking about monarchies. I'm talking about any government. Nigeria was finally able to get out from under because of enormous investment from Europe. And that enormous European investment would actually go to Nigerian business owners who were able to build generational wealth. And it took Nigeria about 60 years to get to where they are now. And now they are a very modern country. They have a semi-stable, ultra-white, right-wing government. And, but that wasn't, that didn't occur without intervention from elsewhere. So the reason that Africa can't all model Nigeria and become like Nigeria is because the European colonization forces that came in have pretty much guaranteed that Africa can't. When Belgium came in and did their thing in Rwanda and the Congo and Chad, they got all of the local tribes to fight each other, and they really made sure that the local tribes were really angry with each other. And that was something that the Belgique did. So, I mean, yes, I hate the United Kingdom's government, and the government of the United Kingdom has always been evil. Make no mistake about it. But they're not the only bad guys here. So what happened in Central Africa is a direct result of Leopold II and the rubber trade, and the way they were able to prevent any kind of revolt during the era of Leopold II was by getting all these tribes so angry at each other that they would be at never-ending war. So in the Central African regions, a lot of these countries, not all of them, many of them, they're literally, even today, trapped in wars that were started by King Leopold II of Belgium. So the colonial powers guaranteed that no government could rise. Now, again, quick overview. Got that out of the way. World War II happens. And World War II destroys all of the infrastructure, not just logistic, manufacturing, agricultural, all of that infrastructure that's required to power an economy was destroyed at the end of World War II. It was destroyed throughout Europe. It was destroyed throughout Western Russia. It was destroyed in the Pacific Rim. In Africa, the European colonies, the European colonial powers, have been destroying it since the 14th century. In South America and Central America, primarily Spain, Portugal, and France, and the Caribbean. So they were destroying that same economic drivers were being destroyed by the colonial powers, again, going as far back as probably around the 14th century, likely earlier. In South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, all of that was being destroyed by the European colonial powers, the Pacific island powers, so Hawaii, the Virgin Islands, those islands in the South Pacific, all that infrastructure was destroyed by American capitalists. And I shouldn't call them capitalists because they weren't capitalists, they were oligarchs. So Hawaii was forced to give up their kingdom under threat of a U.S. military invasion for, I believe it was the Dole family. So like you go out, you buy a can of Dole pineapples, the Dole family and the Del Montes, they convinced the U.S. government to threaten the Kingdom of Hawaii with invasion unless Hawaii agreed to become a state. So, all of that. Notice the U.S. was untouched. There wasn't a land war in the U.S. So in the post-World War era, the only logistical infrastructure was the U.S. So we could move goods. We're the only country that can move goods. Everywhere else, they have to rebuild their rail lines. They have to rebuild their roads. All those in the U.S., they're intact. We can move goods. That ability to move goods allowed us to sell goods everywhere. Our factories are still standing. So when we reconverted from a military economy back to a consumer economy, the rest of the world is still building factories. The U.S. is producing goods. You wanted to buy something, it had to be American made. We're the only people with substantial manufacturing infrastructure. We're the only people that have goods to sell. So up and until about the 1970s, as the rest of the world is rebuilding, we're the only game in town. When the U.S. became the world's largest economic power, that allowed us to become the superpower worldwide. Again, I'm not discounting Theodore Roosevelt's decision to invest heavily in the Navy. I'm not discounting Franklin Roosevelt's decision to invest heavily in an Air Force. I'm not discounting Eisenhower's decision to create DARPA. All of that helped. But realistically, what propelled us to the number one spot worldwide was we were the only people that had anything to sell. We were the only people that could reliably produce goods. The rest of the world had to rebuild all the infrastructure. Now, in modern times, it's China. China is the manufacturing capital of the world. There are a few reasons for it. The biggest reason is because Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan gave industry incentive to fire their local workers. So the policies under Reagan and the economic policies under Margaret Thatcher made it wise, right? So they incentivized firing American workers and firing British workers and firing local workers to move factories to China for not just the lower labor costs, because at the time it was happening, labor costs in China were pennies to the dollar. But our economic policy in the U.S. and in the United Kingdom primarily, not uniquely, right? So the whole of Europe was doing the same thing. Even Russia was doing it. Or at that time it would be the Soviet Union. It wasn't Russia anymore. They were offshoring to China at the expense of their own local populations. And the reason they were doing that was because the government was giving them incentives to do that. And by incentives, I mean they weren't punishing them and they were rewarding them. Taxpayer dollars were actually paying for that offshoring. So that's how China became the major manufacturing power. Now, as time goes on, China is going to supplant the U.S. because if you want to buy something, the only place that makes it is China. Same thing that happened to the U.S. at the Second World War. But if you really want to know what made the U.S. a superpower, it's because for a span of about 25 to 30 years, you wanted to buy something, it had to be an American product. And in the future, it's going to be China. You want to buy something, it's got to be a Chinese product. Because everyone else got rid of their manufacturing. Now, I don't think any one country needs to control all the manufacturing. I think that's a bad strategy. With our current political power structure, isolationists are really dumb, right? So anybody that says, oh, well, we don't need the rest of the world to survive, that's not true. If for nothing else, you need the markets. But at the same time, I think it's a great idea to spread manufacturing out across a large area. Not just geographic area, but geopolitical area. If I were somebody who had authority, I'd really be pushing for investment in Africa, building those manufacturing plants, etc., and getting that infrastructure into Africa. The reason for that is you talk about charity and everybody wants to build a well, right? So, like for instance, John Green for Vlogbrothers, and he wrote The Fault in Our Stars, for those of you who don't know who he is. He used his platform to build a maternity hospital in, I want to say Sri Lanka? Sierra Leone? In Asia. He built a maternity hospital in Asia. And he worked with a charity called Partners in Health. And one of the things that Partners in Health does is they build roads. Because the maternity hospital itself is a real sexy philanthropic project. But if the surrounding area can't get to the maternity hospital to have kids, the hospital's useless. If the hospital can't receive patients, there's no point in putting the hospital there. Same with a well. It's a great idea to build wells in the middle of the Sahara Desert. And you can't, because there's an enormous aquifer under there. I read somewhere that There was an aquifer about the size of the Pacific Ocean under the Sahara Desert. And great, let's build a well in the middle of the Sahara Desert. But none of us think about building roads to get to the well. None of us think about building distribution systems so that that water can go to the cities that need that water. Everyone's more than happy to go out there and build the well. Nobody ever thinks about, you got to be able to move the water. Because a well in the middle of nowhere doesn't do anybody any good. So I think moving forward, we don't necessarily need to recreate all of that manufacturing infrastructure back in the United States. Ideally, I would love to see us work with Mexico and Canada as we did in the past under all of the presidents prior to President Trump. It was because of the partnership that the United States and Canada had that General Motors at one point of time was the largest company on earth. And the reason it was the largest company on earth was because of that production partnership with Canada. U.S. agriculture became world famous because of its productivity, but that productivity was powered by human resources that came primarily from Mexico prior to Dwight Eisenhower allowing his bigot flag to fly. I think with all of the destruction that President Trump has wrought, moving past that, and you have to understand and realize that it's going to take 50 years for us to get back to where we were prior to President Trump. But I think that we can rebuild those relationships. I think that we can rebuild that infrastructure. And I think that we can afford to spread the wealth. One of the things that I would love to see is I would love to see higher taxes. You know, not necessarily on the... I don't want to see higher taxes at salaries below $100,000. So, you know, I think, let's say, I think a fair tax rate at $100,000 is going to be about 20%. I think that's fair. And then you just ratchet it up as you get higher and higher. And then, of course, as you get into the higher and higher numbers, the gaps get larger and larger too, but you ratchet up higher, right? So, like, for example, call it, say, a fair tax rate for $1 million a year would be 50%, and then a fair tax rate for $10 million a year would be, say, 65%, right? So you have this $500,000 gap, but you also have a 15% increase in taxes. So I think that would be fair. But anyway, the reason the U.S. became, which is what this video is about, the reason the U.S. became a primary superpower was not because of American exceptionalism. America is not exceptional. We became a superpower because we got lucky. I remember when Reagan was president and somebody would say, God bless America, my response used to be, God has blessed America, and that's our problem. America was always resource rich. We've always had a lot of natural resources here. We've got great soil for growth, as evidenced in California and Florida. Our agricultural industry is very productive. It's not strong, and it's not strong because we killed the small farmer. The family farms, we went out of our way. And that's us, the American electorate. Right, so I want to place blame where blame belongs. We actually invest in I'm sorry, I can't speak right now. We actually incentivized the corporate farmers and the chemical companies that were doing agricultural chemicals. We incentivized them to take over the small family farms and thus killed the small American farmer. And that was us. We voted for that. Not just the people living in the cities, but the small American farmer also voted for that. That was an electorate issue. It wasn't an issue with the capabilities of the farm. I wonder what's going on. Why am I getting that alarm? So, in any case, oh, my keyboard, that's what that alarm was. Gotcha. So, in any case, we became the power because we were the only industry available at the time. So, I think probably in the next video will likely be on education, because I do want to talk about med school tuitions, the problem with med school tuitions, and why I would rather see a Medicaid for All program, and how that would bring down the costs of med school. Alrighty, till next time.